Welcome everyone that's already joined. We'll wait just a few more minutes for people to join. Welcome everyone that's joining. We're just waiting on others to join us from potentially their previous calls. We'll get started in just a minute. Thanks for attending. Welcome, welcome. We'll give it one more minute for people to join. Great to see some familiar and new names joining us today. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a minute. Hopefully we time this well and people are grabbing their lunches, sitting down to this webinar. All right, we will dive in to today's webinar. And thankfully, the most important material will come a few minutes in. So as people join, they may miss my introduction, but they will get the most important materials later on in the conversation. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. So major investments are being made in climate smart agriculture to help farms, ranches, and agricultural businesses invest in opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions driven by market opportunities and to help them build resilience to a changing climate and the inclement weather impacts that they're facing today and will face in the future. Major investments are being made by the USDA. As you may have heard in the last few years, the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities invested $3.1 billion to grow markets for climate smart commodities and bring those investments directly to farms and ranches across the country. There's also been the Inflation Reduction Act that has invested $19.5 billion in NRCS conservation programs over a 5-year period. That federal funding to climate smart agriculture has also spurred match funding and continued efforts by food companies and agriculture companies to reach their sustainability targets by investing in farms and ranches to make climate smart agriculture practices and investments on their operations. One of the major practices that is being invested in through these programs is cover crops, because cover crops has a multitude of benefits across climate, water, and soil health. First, it can, in some cases, improve soil carbon in the top layers of the soil. It can protect soil against erosion, keeping a key natural resource to crop production in place on farms and ranches across the country. It improves soil structure, which can lead to better water retention and water infiltration, helping farms be resilient to impacts from drought and flooding. But farmers have economic questions about cover crops, and they're facing a lack of data. That lack of data is holding them back in making investments in cover crops. In a recent survey from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education program, found that producers that are not implementing cover crops stated that no measurable economic return is a major concern for why they're not making that investment. And this lack of data is therefore holding back producers from making decisions on the profitability and risk management possibilities of cover crops on their operations. But it's not just holding back producers, it's also holding back their financial partners in developing solutions that help make it easier, more profitable, less risky for farmers to make these investments. That includes agricultural lending institutions, food and agriculture companies, and policymakers who have the ability to develop financial solutions that make it easier, more profitable, and less risky for farmers to implement practices like cover crops. So this lack of data is holding back farmers and their partners in being able to make these investments. That's why over the last couple of years, Environmental Defense Fund and its partners at the University of Minnesota's Center for Farm Financial Management, the Minnesota Farm Business Management Program, as well as the Southwest Minnesota Farm Business Management Association, have partnered to develop a way of gathering financial data and a program to develop that financial data on cover crops over multiple years across over 100 farms across Minnesota and neighboring states so that farmers have trusted data from real farms to help them understand the economics of cover crops, how it may impact their investments and decisions, as well as inform researchers, policymakers, and other key stakeholders that can advance our understanding and the solutions available for farmers to invest in practices like cover crops. I'm Vincent Gauthier. I'm a senior manager on Environmental Defense Fund's Climate Smart Agriculture team, and I've had the pleasure over the last few years to work with these partners in developing this really exciting program to help producers make these decisions. In today's webinar, we're going to cover how this data is being gathered by our partners in the farm business management programs. We're going to share some of the results on how cover crops are impacting the financial profitability of cash crops following that cover crop. We're also going to dive into a new comparison that we've done this year, looking across producers with different levels of experience with cover crops and how, if at all, it's influencing the financial profitability of that practice. We're going to go through some conclusions and key takeaways after a few years of gathering this data, and we're going to end with an opportunity for you all to submit questions through the Q&A function that we will answer as a group. So to get us started with the details of this program and the insights that we've gathered thus far, Keith Olander from the Minnesota Farm Business Management Program is going to dive into how we're working with farmers to gather this data and how it's being shared out. Keith, over to you.
Thank you, Vincent. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Keith Olander, and I am part of the leadership structure for Minnesota Farm Business Management. My background, I've been at the ag education world for about 30 years. I am a practitioner farmer myself. And so agriculture is a part of, I guess, my lifeblood, so to speak. I'm going to share a little bit about what farm business management is. And then as we get into the numbers, we're going to talk from two different perspectives. This whole farm, how cover crops impacts the whole farm, and then how it impacts the enterprise level. Farm business management operates in about 18 states across the country. It is quite strong in Minnesota, and it is at a college level. However, farmers don't attend a college building in this case. It's a different type of program. We've got about 65 faculty that are out at the farm site, one-on-one, student-led, and it's designed for the farmer. But on our side of it, from an education perspective, it's about record keeping, management of inventories, and really looking at cash accounting, and then how does that play into an accrual basis, and really getting students aware of that. Farmers like to farm, and most of them will admit that record keeping and cash accounting is not what they like, but they know very well that it's critical to their long-term success to be viable. So why would farm business management be interested in cover crops? Because farmers are. And so our job is to figure out how is it that, as Vincent mentioned, the data comes alongside of this to help inform them. And that's really where we want to be, is to have information from a financial perspective about decision making on the farm and how it impacts them, both in good times and in bad. We use this tool called FinPack, and that might be notable. Pauline is going to come out and talk about FinBin, and you may want to become familiar with that tool. It's the largest data set in the country in terms of farm financial data specific to the enterprising, but it becomes our tool, our textbook. It's obviously a software in which we can take record keeping to move that forward into a central database, which really becomes a powerful tool to benchmark farmers in their various aspects of cost against one another. I also bring this forward because I talk about data integrity, and we're going to talk about the numbers in this program, but our faculty are on the ground literally at the farm 6 to 8 weeks, or every 6 to 8 weeks. And so it builds a lot of trust in the relationship. Our faculty know a lot about the farm, but at the same time, it's the idea of that data is quality, accurate, and consistent. And we have over 7 decades of history behind us to demonstrate that. So let's go ahead forward to the next slide, Milan, and just take a look at where our students are located. So in this case, in 2023 for the analysis, you can see the Minnesota map, the counties, and how dense in terms of the population of FBM. There was 2,300 of them. We have nearly 3,000 enrolled, but 2,300 of them completed the analysis. What that means to us is that every product, every dollar on that farm was tracked, and every product produced has a break-even cost to it. So corn, soy, wheat, dairy, beef, hogs, you name it. We especially crops, emerging farmers, all types of different groups within this. But in this case today, we're going to focus on cover crops. But that gives you a little bit of a feel for that. If I were to put the cover crop map up of where those producers are, you would find it spread geographically very much the same right across the board in terms of representatives. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the beginning or the cover crop farmers look like. Milan, if you want to advance forward. Well, let's touch base here just a little bit in the median net farm income. If you're not familiar with farming, and our friends at Farm Financial Management down at the University of Minnesota, which Pauline is from, produced this, and we really appreciate the cumulative data. But farming income is, just as this particular graph indicates, variable, very variable, if you think of it that way. And there are peaks and valleys. And so from a cover crop perspective, or any type of perspective where we're going to look at change, something new, all of this has to be taken into account. So if you look at current projections with USDA, we're looking at a reduction in net farm income again. So we're going to fall off of that 44,000. Now you might say, well, what does that go for? Well, you got to think about family living, healthcare, taxes, principal payments, all of those things come into this. And so we say, what would be a good number? I always like to see 70 or 80,000 here. Family living alone in Minnesota for a average farm is about 65,000. So you might say, well, how do they make up the difference if they're only getting 44? Well, off-farm income. And so just kind of think about that as we think about cover crops. We think about the cover crop itself, but we also think about the tillage systems and how those change. And so how a farmer views this. And one thing that keep in mind, they're great environmentalists, but they need to pay the bills. And that's forefront of each of their minds as they go forward. So they've got to figure out financial viability along with environmental sustainability as those two fit together. So kind of keep that in mind as we talk about costs and how we incur them, particularly in 2023 as we go into 2024 with really what we're seeing in a significant downtrend in economic return on the farm. And again, we expect this, but it just changes the decisions and how we approach all things new, if you will. So let's go ahead and advance forward. And this is going to reference back to the map, but I want you to think of that 2,300 number, and I showed you all those counties. So there's 141 of them participating in cover crops out of that. We find that to be significant. That's a fair number of farms. The geography, if I were to show you the exact counties, are spread across this entire map. Just note that there's 129 in Minnesota. There are 12 in Wisconsin. As we build a cohort over in Wisconsin, we're looking to expand further in the Midwest to broaden the footprint. The other thing I want you to pay attention to are the colors. As we reference these points of north and south, in this particular case, we're just referencing where the data comes from. So blue, north, And then, of course, you'll see the differences in the green with the south, just nuances as we think of that. And of course, you think about whether it's corn or beans or sugar beets or wheat or corn silage, as Pauline is going to talk about, all of these things play in terms of enterprising as we go forward. All right, Milan, let's step on forward. This chart, and I apologize if you're not a numbers fan, but this is significant because I want you to look at the cohort compared to all the farms in the fin bin. And statistically, you will not find a difference, and that is good. So we want a cohort that we can take to farmers and say, this is the data we're finding, and it is, quote unquote, the average farmer. We do not want to handpick ones that are more successful at this or that. We want to find the average. So you're finding, one thing I will point out, of those of you that are more federally perspective, the average age on the federal level is closer to 57. In Minnesota, in our cohort, it's 47, and that's because we have a lot of beginning farmers involved. But that being said, years of farming, you look at the average or median net farm income, slight difference, but nothing statistical. Net worth will tell you the size of farms. Again, you're finding the size of farms to be very, similar. And then financial terminology, debt to asset and operating expense ratios are very close to each other. So I really want you to take home, we've got authentic data, and this cohort is what we consider average farms, and that's a good thing and a positive terminology here when you're beginning to pick out a cohort. Let's go ahead and step forward to the next one. Things to think about in terms of terms or just words. So cover crops to us, when we entered into this with our students, and what we have is a 3-year project running, as Vincent alluded to, we're in year 2. And I'm sorry, we're in year 3. We've come out of 2 years of data. The cover crop is planted in the fall and then is going to be harvested or terminated in the winter, just as it says as we go forward. The primary crop is the next year. So analysis of the data today is from the 2023 crop based on a 2022 fall crop, cover crop with that. But I will also share with you, if you're not following, that cover crops are not always successful. This is difference by geography, very near and dear to where I live. We have experienced this fall and 2 years ago were very dry falls. And so getting a cover crop in the fall to germinate, it didn't happen, right? So the challenge is with the cash deposit was made or the expense was made with limited return. And that is quite normal, just as you go through in terms of whether you're going to get cover crop success or not, based upon that ability to germinate. Now, obviously, if it's under a pivot, irrigation pivot, I have a unique advantage to get it started there. The other thing I wanted to point to is there's low profitability in the commodities. So corn, soy, even wheat, very low profitability. I alluded to that in that earlier chart. And so that influences decisions. The other thing you'll keep in mind, farmers don't put cover crops on every acre they own, but we've done some comparisons of those that are on farm with non-cover crop acres and cover crop acres, so that we get a management perspective in there, because each farm is going to be unique in that setting in terms of their management. And of course, these dry conditions weren't existent everywhere. So there were success in cover crops. Let's step forward. All right, so let's pick this apart a little bit. You're looking at average gross return, and then this average total direct expense, just as indicates, you see a green and blue there. It just puts everything together, but let's pick apart this rice silage a little bit. On farms where there are livestock, or you have neighbors that have livestock, somehow you want to harvest a forage off of there. So rice silage is a forage form. We see that come in from a perspective of what the return is versus the expense. And there is no secret, I think, if you spend time studying this, that if we have livestock on the farm, cover crops tend to play a more positive role just from an economic perspective. And by the way, I know some of you are going to share, well, you're only looking at the money side, and that is correct. We are not taking into account the soil health benefits. That's not part of our world, and that will be a different subject for a different day. So I want to appease that comment, or at least that concern that you may have in your head. But that, as I move across the page, let's just look at cover crop for rye mix or cover crop mix. While the expense is there at roughly $50 or $49 an acre, and I kind of want you to hold on to that number because it's going to be significant in my future slide, but the return is not there on a financial. And that's why my comment says, we're not here. All I'm trying to do is clarify for the farmer what the returns are. The soil health component is excluded from anything that we've got in the numbers. as you think about that. So just look at that, but it is an investment. So if I'm already losing in a cash situation on the farm, as indicated in my earlier chart, am I going to make this investment, right? And so that's where this begins to play in a little bit. So you see that. So obviously my summary on this particular piece, if livestock is there and I'm harvesting a forage, life isn't so bad with a cover crop, provided I can get it germinated and growing. But if I'm just doing it for the sake of a cover crop to soil health, it's an investment for the farmer. That's just how I'll word it, and we'll leave it at that for now. Again, because I'm not adding in the components of the soil health. Milan, let's go ahead and step forward here just a little bit. The other thing that we get asked about is this cost share in this. So out of all of these 129 farms, if you think about it that way, roughly half, about 44%, a little less than, did get some cost share. And you can get that and you can study those on your own to what's available. There's different options, both public and private options to get cost shared. Out of all of that coverage, so you think of the half of coverage, it only covered about 43% or less than half of the cost. So go back to my $50 cost on the previous chart. Roughly half of that, or not even, is covered by a cost share if at all possible. So my point is there's still an investment by the farmer, even with this scenario playing out. But it is a cost share, and nonetheless, it can be accessed out there as incentives through various programs, both public and private. So just kind of hopefully answers that question, because we do get asked that a lot. Let's go ahead and step forward then. So what I've shared with you now on this particular set of slides is we looked at the whole farm, right? And how it impacts that. Now, Pauline is going to come on and she's going to talk about specific enterprises as it relates to what happens on the farm and the impacts on that. I just wanted to share with you in my summary that we talked about what farm business management is, where the data is coming from, how we're answering questions for farmers. The cohort that we've got put together, we believe very strongly in from the standpoint geographically, it's spread. It's also very comparable to the average in the database in that. And then I want to wrap up in my comments just saying that we got to understand and respect the fact that that farmer is always making decisions about economic viability every year. And right now, the row crop situation is not real great now, nor does it look great in 25 based on a number of factors. And that all weighs into the fact of how I'm going to invest in the cover crop, but also the alternative tillage systems that I'm going to probably deploy in that process. So with that, Pauline, if you want to take it from here, we love being a partnership with CFFM, the Center for Farm Financial Management, and the work that they do as they collate all of the data that comes from the farms that we work with. Pauline?
Yes, thanks, Keith, for providing that overview of the analysis methodology and the cover crop data. Next, like Keith said, we're going to focus on the impact cover crops have on the commodity crops grown after them. But first off, let me introduce myself. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pauline Van Nurden. I'm an extension economist with the Center for Farm Financial Management at the University of Minnesota. At CFFM, if you want to go to the next slide. At CFFM, we develop software and tools for farmers and the professionals that work with them. These tools are focused on farm financial planning and analysis. The cover crop analysis is a great example of the type of collaborative work we engage in. Our ultimate goal with efforts like this is to help farmers make informed decisions for their farming operation. Much of my personal work at CFFM focuses on FinPack and FinBin. FinPack, like Keith said, is our farm financial management software used to help farmers better understand and manage their finances. This is the program that's used by farm management instructors and farmers themselves to do so. The individual farm analysis information completed in FinPack is then aggregated for inclusion in the FinBin database. FinBin is the National Farm Financial Database. This is a public database that anyone can query at finbin.umn.edu. We work with partner organizations like the Minnesota State College System to aggregate this actual farm data. There are nearly 3,500 farms assembled in FinBin annually from across 12 or more states. There are whole farm, crop, and livestock specific reports available in FinBin. Before it being added to FinBin, the data goes through several levels of review and quality checks. The financial analysis completed on each farm adheres to the farm financial standards. And it's important to note that individual farm data is never retrievable from FinBin. Only data at the summary level is provided in the reports generated. Next slide, please. Here is how the cover crop impact analysis in the report is accomplished. The combined enterprise is the combined total of the commodity crop that was grown after a cover crop along with the cover crop. This combined enterprise includes all revenue and all expenses of both of these crop enterprises. The benchmark enterprise is the average of the same commodity crop type planted in the region. The fields in this group were not planted, after cover crops. Our analysis methodology uses the following approach to evaluate the financial metrics provided. Next slide, please. We start with gross return. This is comprised of the production value of the crop harvested plus any additional revenue. Additional revenue may be received from things like crop insurance, hedging, government payments, and other cost share programs. Next, we subtract total direct expenses. These are the input costs specific to growing that crop, like seed, fertilizer, chemical, crop insurance, fuel, and repairs. The farm would not have these expenses if the crop wasn't planted. Then the overhead expenses are subtracted. These are other costs the farm incurs whether or not the crop was planted. These include things like utilities, farm insurance, real estate taxes, depreciation, and interest. Gross return minus total direct and overhead expenses gives the net return per acre. Our analysis then goes one step further and also includes a labor and management charge. The labor and management charge is an opportunity cost that values the producer's time and effort on the farm. This is a non-cash cost, but an important consideration when a farm is looking at the profitability of an enterprise. This value can be thought of as the amount needed to cover family living expense for most farm operations. Subtracting the labor and management charge from net return gives a net return over labor and management per acre. This is what we consider the bottom line profitability for a crop enterprise. As you can see from this analysis methodology, and just like Keith said a moment ago, we're looking at actual revenue and expense information. We recognize other factors like land productivity, growing conditions, management styles, and weather events can certainly impact profitability. But these are not captured directly in our analysis and also are not controlled for. Next slide, please. Let's dig into the impacts of cover crops on crop enterprises now. Here's a summary of our findings from the 2023 analysis. First, gross returns were generally similar for crops planted after a cover crop to those that were not. Next, those fields planted after a cover crop generally had lower fertilizer expenses than the average field in the area. And lastly, once all of the expenses and the labor and management charge for the farmer's time are included, all of the crop enterprises that were planted following cover crops had a lower net return than the same commodity crop grown without a cover crop. Next slide, please. In the next few slides, we'll take a look at the results for two key crops in Minnesota, corn and soybeans. The data we will evaluate comes specifically from southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. This production area is very similar to the conditions and soil productivity found in the rest of the Midwest Corn Belt. We further break down these crops by land tenure type, looking at returns to owned and rented land. To start here, we see the comparative results for corn on owned land in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. I'll review this slide in more detail to be sure you understand our results. The blue bar is for the combined enterprise we talked about before. This is the combined corn and cover crop enterprise information. This combined enterprise will be displayed as a colored bar on each of the next slides. The gray bar is the benchmark information. This is the other cornfields grown in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin that were not planted after a cover crop. The benchmark crop will always be displayed in gray on the next slides. Looking specifically at the corn information here, we see the non-cover cropped corn fields had a $56 higher gross return. With that, it was about $50 more expensive to get that return since the direct and overhead expenses plus labor and management charge were more for the benchmark fields that were grown without a cover crop. When looking at the net return information, we can see the combined corn acres with a cover crop had a $5 better net return before labor and management charge. After factoring in the labor and management charge, the combined acres had a slightly lower or $4 less per acre net return. The bottom line on these owned corn acres was positive for both production types on average in 2023. Next slide, please. Next, let's take a look at corn grown on rented ground. Here we can see the corn grown after a cover crop had an almost $25 lower gross return. In this analysis, the total expenses were also higher on these combined acres. This led to a $50 lower net return per acre than the benchmark corn acres that were not grown after a cover crop. In both instances, the average producer lost money on rented corn acres in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin in 2023. But the corn acres grown after a cover crop were even less profitable. Next slide, please. Now we will move on to soybeans grown on owned land. The soybean acres grown after a cover crop had a $7 higher average gross return per acre than the benchmark soybean fields. The total expenses related to this production were also over $50 higher per acre for the combined soybean and cover crop fields. This led to a lower net return before and after labor and management charge for soybean acres planted after a cover crop. As you can see, the average net returns for soybeans planted on owned land in 2023 were strong in general for all producers, but those who did not include cover crops in their production practices had an even greater net return on average. Next slide, please. Lastly, we see soybeans planted on rented ground in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. The combined soybean acres planted after a cover crop had a $14 lower gross return per acre, $48 of higher total expenses per acre, and lower overall net returns per acre. When factoring in a labor and management charge, the combined soybean and cover crop acres had a $62 lower net return than the benchmark soybean fields. Next slide, please. One of the other key takeaways I shared earlier was fertilizer expenses were generally lower for those combined crop enterprises as compared to the benchmark fields. Here are a few examples of this fertilizer expense comparison for specific crops. We can see the lower fertilizer costs for all the crops planted after cover crops except for corn silage. The fertilizer expense for the combined crop is the green bar on this chart. Looking at this further, the largest difference in fertilizer expense was seen on wheat acres grown after a cover crop statewide in Minnesota. The average fertilizer expense for combined wheat and cover crop acres was $38 less than the benchmark wheat acres in the state. In summary, I hope this information gives you a snapshot of our analysis methodology and also the profitability of crops planted after cover crops as compared to benchmark acres planted without cover crops of the same commodity type. Overall, the gross returns were generally similar when comparing the combined enterprise to the benchmark enterprise for each of the different commodities. But if you look at the full report, you will see the net return after labor and management is lower for all of the combined enterprises that were grown after a cover crop in 2023 as compared to those benchmark fields that were not grown after a cover crop. As part of our analysis work, we not only looked at the total revenue expenses, but also the individual expense items. That analysis showed the lower fertilizer expense for the farms using cover cropping practices as compared to those that are not. In the report we prepared is quite extensive and took this analysis of the total expenses one step further. In the report, we also analyzed the impact years of experience with cover cropping practices had on profitability of these crop enterprises. Mylan will take us through that information next.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And hi, everyone. My name is Mylan Hoang, and I'm a research analyst on the Climate Smart Agriculture team at the Environmental Defense Fund. So far, we've seen that farmers who implemented cover crops had lower net returns on the combined enterprise compared to those who did not use cover crops. But we also know that implementing a new practice like cover cropping requires time, learning, and experience. Many benefits may take years to materialize. So the important question is, do people with more experience have better success? Or is there a learning curve where farmers become more cost efficient as they gain more experience? The following results will answer these questions. Here, we see a breakdown of the farms in our cohort based on their cover crop experience. And this is measured by the years that they've been planting cover crops. Among these farms, 38% have more than 6 years of experience. 33% have 4 to 5 years, and a slightly lower share have less than 3 years of experience. This shows that there's a good representation of each level of experience in our data. When we compared the costs associated with cover crops across different levels of production experience, we found an interesting trend. The producers with more cover crop production experience incurred lower expenses, and this is most clearly observed in the median total direct expense, as shown in the graph on the right. You can see that farms with less than 3 years of experience had the highest expense, while those with more than 6 years of experience had the lowest direct expense per acre. Next, the results vary when we compare the returns from the primary commodity crops and the preceding cover crop across different experience levels. You see that the blue bars represent gross returns and the green bars indicate net returns. For soybeans, we found that more experienced farms tend to achieve higher returns on their combined enterprises. However, this trend is less evident for corn. So far, we've discussed a lot of interesting data, but before you leave the webinar today, here are the key findings that we want you to take away. First, the cost and returns of cover crops vary depending on the intended use. Cover crops planted for feed purposes not only cover the production costs, but also provide financial benefits to the farm. Second, cost share payments can significantly reduce the costs associated with cover crops. They offset about 43% of the total expenses on average. And we also found that the average net return of the combined enterprise, once the expenses for cover crops are accounted for, was lower than the net return for the commodity crops planted without a cover crop. And finally, farmers with more experience in growing cover crop tend to incur lower expenses compared to those with less experience. If you're interested in analyzing more detailed information from the report, you can take a look at our report, and the link to our report is available in the chat. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these findings represent only 1 year of data, while the benefits of cover crops may surface over a longer period of time or during extreme weather events. In addition to that, as Pauline mentioned earlier, there are many other factors that affect the financial outcomes that our data does not capture directly. For instance, consider how factors like land productivity, growing conditions, and management styles may affect a farm's decisions to implement cover crops and their choice of which fields to plant them in. All of them contribute to the differences in profitability between cover cropped and non-cover cropped acres. So looking ahead, our next steps include continuing to gather detailed financial data on cover crops in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We're also expanding our cohort to include farms in North Dakota and South Dakota in 2024. We expect that these results will be available next year. Now, and then once we've compiled data from all 3 years, we'll plan to analyze the highest performing farms to understand differences in costs and returns. This will help us identify the key factors that contribute to the profitability of cover crop enterprises. In addition to that, we will also conduct a comprehensive benchmarking analysis of our cover crop data. This will involve in analyzing trends and comparing financial results over all 3 years in order to provide a deeper insight into the economics of cover crops. With that, we'd like to open the floor for any questions that you may have. And I would also like to invite Vincent Gauthier to moderate our Q&A section.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mylan. And thanks to Keith and Pauline for that great information. And I really recommend everybody go check out the link to the final report that Deja included in the chat. And we have other resources available on our website as well. I really encourage you all put your questions into the Q&A function. If not, you're going to be stuck with my questions, which made me less informative than yours. I did see that we had a question in there from Laura Gentry. And before I answer it, I will say shameless plug for the work that Laura Gentry does with the Precision Conservation Management Program in Illinois. They do great work to analyze the financial impacts of cover crops, reduced tillage, nitrogen fertilizer management on farms in Illinois that really complements the work that we're doing here on cover crops in Minnesota. So if you haven't checked out the great work that PCM is doing, definitely go do that. I hope that was okay, Laura. Your question, Laura, the first question that you added in there, that you answered yourself, but I will bring it up to everyone because I think there's some important things to dive into, which is, are the cost share and incentive payments included in the gross return value within this data analysis? And the answer is yes, we are including cost share payments within the gross return. And this year we've even outlined that specifically from government payments within the data tables that are provided in the report. So you can see how much gross return is being received specifically from government payments and other types of cost share payments. One thing I'll add to the numbers that Keith presented earlier, he presented that 44% of our cohort got some sort of cost share or incentive payment. And within those 44% of the farms, 43% of their costs related to the cover crop were covered by that cost share. But if we look at the entire cohort and the entire amount of costs that cohort is taking on for cover crops, it's only 10% of all those costs that are being covered by cost share. So 90% of the costs from our cohort are being paid by the farmer. That's why these investments that I mentioned earlier, from the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, from the NRCS conservation programs and food company incentive programs, state level incentive programs, are really important to help make the economics of cover cropping become much more easy for the farmer to swallow and to take into their economics. So I know you answered your own question, Laura, but I wanted to add a little bit of flavor to those numbers. While I read through some of these additional questions, Keith, I had one question for you. You farm and you're very aware of the trade-offs that you have to make and the risk management that you have to make on a farm. Milan mentioned that as you make decisions about implementing a new practice that you don't really know like what the impacts are going to be right away, you make some risk management decisions. How are there risk management decisions when a producer is starting cover crops that may be influencing, again, we don't have the numbers, but theoretically could be influencing the reduced enterprise performance after cover crops as compared to the benchmark?
Sure. Thank you, Vincent. I can hit that from a couple different angles. Obviously, the one we think about as it relates to what we've been experiencing this fall, at least in some parts of Minnesota, are drought. So when you're thinking about putting that cover crop in, and depending upon how far you're going to let it go in the spring, you've always got water at top of mind, moist soil moisture in terms of what's available for the crop. So you've got to figure out around that perspective. Now, obviously, we've got 600,000 acres of irrigation in Minnesota, and that changes your perspective when you can utilize irrigation to, start and sustain a cover crop from that perspective. The other side of risk management, when I do a cover crop, I'm more than likely changing up my planting and tillage practices. I may change to no-till. I may change to strip till, minimum till. There's just a lot of things that are part of that. And so now I'm altering the equipment that I may purchase. I have to have part of my operation. So understand that, when you make these decisions as a farmer, and I think I've, shared this and you guys can Google these numbers, but if you want to move to a strip till machine, which is very popular, and all I'm doing now is I'm just tilling a particular strip where the seed is going the next spring into the cover crop, I can easily spend a $250,000 investment. Now, obviously, I can share that with neighbors, perhaps. I know some have done that. If I'm going to go to a no-till, commonly the planter that I have been using will not work, or I need to put on a system of down pressure because I'm now putting it in differently in terms of not having a tilled seed bed. So these are all types of risk management decisions that how is my moisture going to play out that from that side? How is my equipment line going to run? And then as it affects my operation. And again, Vincent, we talk about if it's new, we don't do this across all acres. It's something you want to try. And that's where a lot of farmers start, is they try to utilize what is the equipment that I do have in the management by which I procure crops, from a planting through harvest. And how do I implement this and see that? Because they certainly hear from neighbors. There are advantages as it relates to things that happen via weather, or just the idea that Pauline brought up of, this idea of reduced chemical or fertilizer are all aspects that are, people are talking about. So it's balancing in this risk management of the possibilities versus what the actualities are of making a system change.
Fantastic. Thanks, Keith. I'm going to go through a few additional insightful questions that have been added to the chat. Rod or Jesus, good to see you. Thank you for including some of these questions. Rod asked, and maybe I'll point this to Milan if you're able to answer this. Rod asks if we were able to compare the profitability of fields within our cover crop cohort, where comparing the fields where they are using cover crops to the fields where they are not using cover crops. Because of course, in that cohort of 140 farms, they're not planting cover crops on all of their fields. So we're able to compare within that group. Is there anything you would like to share, Milan, about what we find between those comparisons?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is yes, we recognize the differences, even for farms within that cohorts, that some of them will only plant cover crops on a portion of their acres. So in the report, you will find more detailed table comparisons where we will show the costs and expenses of the fields that have used cover crops and those fields that did not use cover crops for the same farms. So in the report, you'll be able to see this detailed comparison and how they compare to the benchmark who did not use cover crop at all. So this is a very important point. And yes, we did look at this data and you'll be able to see it in our report.
And then additionally, Pauline, this one may be for you, but anyone can jump into this one. Was there analysis done for the profitability of leguminous versus non-leguminous cover crops? Is there any insight that we can gather from the performance of cover crops that include a legume versus those that don't?
Well, Keith shared some of the basic results on the cover crop itself. We have several different cover crop species, if you will, that are highlighted in the report. In terms of the impact specifically on the profitability of the primary crop that follows it, we don't differentiate, or we haven't at this point differentiated the cover crop type in that analysis. So we have just included, and if you did a FinBin report, that's what you would find as well, all cover crops that were planted prior to corn acres, for example, are lumped together. At this point, I don't think we have enough data to dig into the specific cover crop types further to analyze that even deeper than what we have. So a good idea for the future, but we have not done that at this point.
That's the best part of this Q&A. We got a lot of our research questions put in front of us that we can explore in the coming years. And as we get through 2024, that'll be our third year of data. We'll be able to dig into some of these questions further, do more rigorous analysis across 3 years worth of data. Another question that was asked, Milan, you've been thinking about how we compare farms with different levels of experience with cover crops. Ben asks, with the farms with more experience that were able to have lower costs for their cover crop investments themselves, were there specific line items within their cover crop programs that they were able to specifically reduce compared to the farms that have less experience with cover crops?
So in the report, we do look at this data. So you find that we have a cost comparison of different experience levels, and you see a breakdown of costs across seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel and oil, and the total direct expense. On the aggregate level, we do see a trend, as I mentioned earlier, that farms with more experience tend to incur lower costs. But for the specific line item, you see that there are variations across these different costs in the report. But for example, for seed, you find that the trend isn't as clear. The farms that have 4 or 5 years of experience had the lowest seed expense compared to the other groups. But you find that the trend is clearer in some of the other expense types. So do take a look at our report to see the more detailed comparisons.
And then somewhat similar, and this might be to Pauline or Mylan, were there specific expense categories that seem to really be driving a lot of the added costs for the producers that are implementing cover crops compared to the benchmark? Like, is it really the seed costs that, you know, one farm doesn't have, the other does because they're implementing cover crops, and that just makes the difference? Or are there other aspects of implementing this additional practice that is really driving up the costs and making the net returns different between the implementers and non-implementers?
Yeah, I can take that first and others can add on to it. But so I would certainly point everyone to the more detailed report and then specifically the appendix, because we do break out some of or a lot of these expenses in more detail there. So you can see the better comparison here. We just gave you the totals for brevity and just for a presentation like this. But in general, I would say yes, seed expense is one of those expenses that is higher for a cover crop cohort, just because there are 2 seeds that are being planted, right? So that is more expensive. Another one of the expenses in general that as I glance through the detailed appendix tables here would be machinery costs. Again, we're having you know, at least one more pass, maybe multiple additional passes. So the machinery cost, which is made up of fuel, repairs, custom hire, machinery depreciation, machinery interest, machinery leases. So all of those things related to machinery, no matter if I have my own line of equipment I'm using or I'm hiring that out, are captured in that machinery cost number. I would say in general, those are the 2 biggest. There may be some chemical differences as well, depending. But I think a lot of that is driven by seed and machinery cost. Other expenses tend to just vary for farms as well in general. And that's a lump. That's a lumpy number, a very lumpy number. We're lumping everything but seed, fertilizer, chemicals, crop insurance, machinery costs, and land type costs in that number. So you can go to Finbin and find out more detail if you'd like, but that does give you all the other expenses. And I think, as was pointed out earlier, the labor and management charge is generally higher as well for our cover crop cohort or for that enterprise. Again, simply because they are putting more time and effort into that production practice, given the, you know, the 2 crops being planted on the same field and such. So
Thanks, Pauline. I do want to answer a few other questions before we close this out. Jackie asks about if all these cover crops were terminated or if some of them were used for feed. Yes, Jackie, some of these cover crops were used for feed. We have a category of rye silage, and it was clear from our analysis that the farms that were planting a rye silage cover crop were able to see financial profitability from that cover crop directly, unlike the other cover crops that were more investments in soil health for long-term benefits. So when, as Keith mentioned earlier, when there is an opportunity to use that cover crop for livestock feed, it pencils out much more clearly in the short term than for soil health benefits on their own. I want to end with a final, and I'm taking the liberty of being the moderator here. I want to ask one final question to you, Keith, because we provide this presentation to a lot of different implementers of programs, researchers on this webinar, but really the end audience is the producers. You work directly with producers across the state of Minnesota and beyond. How does this information get to the producers, and what types of insights are your programs providing directly to producers as they consider the financial profitability impacts of implementing cover crops?
Thank you, Vincent. So going back to our number earlier, there's about 3,000 students. Our audience, public audience, is about 4,000 to 5,000 producers, because we do a lot of public data type presentations. So what I'm getting at is, within those public data sets, we have a slideshow of cover crop information. Furthermore, we have an executive summary of your report that we're sharing internally with our producers. If you go back to the farm business management model, it's a discussion. I'm thinking about this. What does it look like? What do I need to change? What would I need to try? The other side is, we have peer group models that work internally in our system. So our faculty have students get together, and I say students, they're farmers. And then this discussion comes up. And then we're also promoting within our state anything that pertains to information around cover crops. Some of our local co-ops now are really starting to come on board in terms of having information available, and certainly it's available at our soil and water districts and our NRCS offices. So that's really, we're just diffusing the information, trying to answer questions. Again, it's this trial type setup where we try some acres, and then of course there are some that have done it and done it well. And in certain areas of our state, there was immediate response based on the mitigation of climate. So one quick example: excess water. If you've got a cover crop and you've got a live root in the soil, you're on that soil a good week ahead of your neighbors, and that probably is the way you drive more adoption practice than anything, is what neighbors can tell neighbors. And that's why we're proud to have this particular data set ranges across the geography, and then of course across the crop. So hopefully, Vincent, that gives you a little feel for how we integrate that data back for our farmers, again, just trying to inform them as they want to make their decisions for their operations.
Yeah, we have so many farmers participating in this program and providing really insightful information to their peer group, but also to many other practitioners across the sector. So it's really great to hear the ways that you're bringing that information back to producers, those peer groups, those events where they're hearing this information, they're thinking about how it's going to impact their decision making on their farm. So before we close out, we'll hopefully give you a few minutes back to prepare for your next meeting. As a summary, this program is gathering really key, insightful information at a large scale across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and neighboring states on the financial implications of cover crops. We just presented year 2. We're going to be continuing to gather this data across 2024 and do more analysis over the coming years that we're excited to share with you all. If you'd like to learn more, please scan the QR code that's currently on the slide. That will bring you to the resources of this program. That's where you can find the detailed tables of all the costs, the enterprise analyses, the comparisons across years of experience that we talked about today. If you have any questions about the program itself, what we're doing, please don't hesitate to email any of us on this slide. And if you're interested in efforts to bring this type of data and insight across the country to more producers, don't hesitate to reach out to us as well for some policy opportunities that we're driving to help producers across the country have access to this type of insightful information about the financial impacts of conservation practices. Thank you all for attending today. We hope this was insightful, and we look forward to the follow-ups that you all share via email, via your own work, and how you engage producers on investing and implementing practices like cover crops. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.